Well, hello ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to this on Commentators, the Historical Studies Society of the University of Galway's 5th lecture in their present series of lectures on the general theme of impactful Irish general elections. And the subject and the topic of tonight's lecture is under the title of Your Kind of Country. It's the 1977 Irish general election. An election which was quite significant and quite consequential. Now, it was not a change election in the same vein as most of those other elections that we have looked at previously. This was not an election which saw, for instance, a new party or new government coming to power after a prolonged period in which a different political party had been in government, such as with the 1932 onto the 1948 and then up until the 1973 general elections, each of which we've covered. Rather, in this case, the victorious Fianna Fáil party at the end of this election in 1977 had only had a brief hiatus in opposition between 1973 and 1977 before returning to power. So as I say, it's not a change election in that sense that we're used to in this lecture series. But as I say, it was a very consequential election. It had significant short, medium and arguably some long-term consequences. And it was an election which was record-breaking in that it saw the largest overall majority in the history of the state to be ever gained by a single party. And in a similar, or on the other side of the coin, it was also the election that broke, ultimately, the tradition that we had been used to in this country up until that point of, with some regularity, a single party being able to achieve an overall majority. For this was the last occasion on which any single party would receive an overall majority. So in that sense, as I say, a quite consequential election. Okay, so in order to get a full understanding of the context in terms of the campaign of 1977, we first have to go back to the outcome of the previous election in 1973, which of course we covered previously in this lecture series. So for those of you who joined us for that lecture on the 1973 general election, you might recall that the election campaign was one in which the electorate had a choice between the outgoing Fianna Fáil government led by Jack Lynch and a proposed national coalition between the Fine Gael and Labour parties, with the electorate ultimately plumping for the national coalition option. Fianna Fáil returned with 69 seats in that election, a loss of 6. But the Fine Gael and Labour parties, with their joint manifesto and their joint programme, well, it wasn't technically a manifesto, but it was a joint statement of intent, which was in effect a manifesto. They returned with 54 seats for Fine Gael and 19 seats for the Labour Party, resulting in a slight overall majority then for this combination of Fine Gael and Labour, the new national coalition, as I say, with the consequence that Liam Cosgrave, the leader of the Fine Gael party, became Taoiseach, arguably following in his father's footsteps to a certain extent. It was approximately 50 years after his own father had become the head of government in the Irish state. Liam Cosgrave was now the Taoiseach at the head of the National Coalition government, which is often referred to as the government of all the talents, or actually more popularly known as the cabinet of all the talents, as a consequence of the high number of intellectuals and high-profile intellectuals that were involved in it. People such as Conor Cruise O'Brien from the Labour Party, Justin Keating, another academic and a lecturer in anatomy at Trinity College, but also a member of the Labour Party. It also had Garret FitzGerald there, a member of Fine Gael, a well-known academic. Paddy Cooney, a high-flying member of the legal profession at that time. And then also Declan Costello here, who after again a slight hiatus outside politics had returned in 1973 and became the Attorney General in that particular government, and also regarded as something of an intellectual heavyweight. And of course, if you recall from our previous lecture, he was also the brainchild, if you will, behind the Just Society proposals, which had been adopted by the Fine Gael party in the mid-1960s. And as an example of the somewhat occasional sardonic or certainly the dry wit type humour that Liam Cosgrave, the Taoiseach, would tend to display from time to time. On one occasion when he was being engaged with by a commentator who was asking him about his views, about the general view of his his government being the cabinet of all the talents, Cosgrave was to say, yes, indeed, it's great. I need hardly say that I'm glad to have got a place on it, on the cabinet. It was so well thought of by everyone else, it seemed, in the general commentariat. So this government got off to a rather promising start. There was a lot of early optimism. There was a not insignificant amount of positive press coverage that accrued to the government during its early period in power. Again, after 16 years of Fianna Fáil power, I suppose there was a desire on the part not just of the electorate, but often of the opinion formers as well, to give a chance to this new dispensation. And as I say, a relatively promising start. Its first budget was very well received. You could argue it was an expansionary type budget. There were significant increases in social welfare, which was obviously welcome to certain sections of society. And indeed, it received significant positive press coverage from the Irish Times in relation to this, which declared it the greatest social welfare budget of all time. It was also during the tenure of this government in which the eligibility age for old age pensions was reduced from 70 years to 66, and it also introduced additional supports within the pension system for widows, and it also introduced supports for unmarried mothers, which in the Ireland of the 1970s was seen by many as a rather progressive move on the part of this particular administration. Now, some might argue that part of its initial successes may have been partly due to what appeared to be some increased financial room for manoeuvre in the immediate accession of Ireland to the EEC in January 1973, but as it would transpire, joining the EEC was to have some actual short-term difficulty, or create some short-term difficulties for the Irish economy as we moved into a more free market, open competition system. But nevertheless, as I say, the overall early approach in social and fiscal terms by this government was well received by the commentariat and much of the electorate. And again, on the social progressive side of things, this was also the government that removed the marriage bar, which had been in place since the 1930s and which had prohibited married women from being able to remain in work or to take up work in the public service once they were married or if they were married. And it was this government that removed that bar. Although I should also add, it was partially again due to EEC pressure here as well that the government moved as quickly as they did to remove the marriage bar, because by the time they did come to remove it in the mid part of this administration, the fiscal and financial situation had changed for the government, and they were actually quite worried about the cost implications of removing the marriage bar at that point. But nevertheless, the EEC rather insisted, if you will, that we remove the marriage bar, and so it was done. So, as I say, after this rather promising start, their luck started to run out rather quickly. In the latter part of 1973, in October 1973, what's known as the Yom Kippur War broke out in the Middle East. Again, there are some historical, if not history repeating, there is some rhythm of history with some respect. So this was a war that broke out in the Middle East between Israel and a number of Arab states, in which these Arab states attacked the state of Israel. Whilst Israel was ultimately prevailed in that particular conflict, it did also result in a number of other Arab countries, specifically the oil-producing Arab countries, introducing an oil embargo on effectively Western states that those Arab states viewed as being positively disposed towards Israel. So this oil embargo on effectively the Western world was to result in essentially a global depression, which significantly impacted Ireland at this time, resulted in increased oil prices and indeed oil restrictions or fuel restrictions here in Ireland, and rationing to an effective extent, resulting again, as I say, in inflation, depressed economic output, with the consequence then that the government had to respond to this with what is often known as fiscal rectitude or hair shirt budgetary policy, in which they had to increase borrowing from abroad, but also increase taxes here, and of course, as is never welcome either for the electorate, cutting spending. So this all was to impact then consequently not just the Irish economy, and not just the difficulties faced by the government, but as you can imagine, the popularity of the government was to take something of a hit as well. And then in 1975, the government introduced a wealth tax in order to try and claw back some taxation advantage and to give them some room for manoeuvre. And they introduced for the first time capital gains tax, none of which was welcomed, again I might add, by the electorate. There might be some today who might imagine a wealth tax would not be seen as particularly objectionable, certainly those of particular ideological perspective, but back then in the Ireland at the time, which you had a strong and large agricultural community, wealth tax was not seen as particularly welcome. And indeed, in later years, James Tully, the man who was the minister at the time for local government, but was a stalwart member of the Labour Party, he was to suggest that the unpopularity which accrued to the government as a consequence of its necessary, as they saw it, reaction to the worldwide recession, he felt that, well, ultimately the people gave them no, if you'll pardon the word, the euphemism, effing thanks for all the welfare increases they had given them in the earlier period. So this was a negative in terms of the government's popularity. Then with respect to social issues, again, somewhat there was also something of a negative hue that accrued to the government in some people's eyes, and this was due to the government's introduction of what was known as the Contraception Bill in 1974, more specifically the Control of Importation, Sale and Manufacture of Contraceptives Bill of 1974. And this was introduced because there had been a Supreme Court case the year earlier which had determined essentially that it was the private right of certainly married couples to be able to use contraception if they wished. I won't go into all the details, but there was a lady that brought this case, and it was ultimately Mary McGee, and it was ultimately successful. But this meant that the government now was expected to introduce a bill to regulate and allow for the sale, use and production of contraceptives. So a bill was introduced by the Minister for Justice to this effect. It was clear from very early on the entire Fianna Fáil opposition was going to vote against the bill, which meant it was ultimately necessary that all members of the coalition government would effectively have to vote for it to ensure that it passed, or of the coalition parties. But the Taoiseach, Liam Cosgrave, declared at Cabinet there would be a free vote. In other words, people could vote on the basis of their conscience. Okay, fair enough, one might argue. But then the Taoiseach himself proceeded to vote against his own government's bill on the basis that he was a devout Roman Catholic, and whilst the Supreme Court might have indicated we needed to introduce this bill, Cosgrave, as a devout Roman Catholic, felt he could not vote for it. So whilst the majority of the government parties voted for their own bill, Cosgrave and a small number of other conservative, you could say religiously conservative members of both Fine Gael and the Labour Party voted against it. Combined with the Fianna Fáil opposition, the bill fell, or the bill was lost on the part of the government. And it would be a number of years again before a form of legalised contraception would ultimately be introduced. But as you can imagine, this coloured the perception of some then of the government, and it was to give again it was to copper fasten in many people's minds the view that Cosgrave was a rather conservative and often dour figure on occasion. Okay, and if this unpopularity accruing in particular from the economic issue wasn't enough to be a headache for the government, there was also significant security issues which were to be a regular headache for the government during the entirety actually of their tenure in office, and was to lead ultimately to the perception, both at the time but certainly later, that this was a government obsessed with law and order issues. So despite a brief ray of hope with respect to the troubles in Northern Ireland in late 1973 and early 1974, with the emergence of the Sunningdale Agreement, in which the Irish government under Cosgrave had been heavily involved in negotiating, as I said, this was a brief ray of hope, and the Sunningdale Agreement could be characterised, if one wished, as a Good Friday Agreement for advanced learners, as it was effectively much the same as the Good Friday Agreement that would be achieved later. There are differences, but the overall principle is relatively similar. But this brief ray of hope was shattered rather early on. The Sunningdale power sharing arrangement did not survive. And this, of course, was a negative, therefore, obviously, for the government. But as I say, aside from a brief ray of hope, ultimately, matters relating to security and Northern Ireland were to continue to dog this administration throughout its tenure. Many of you would be familiar and will recall the atrocity of the Dublin Monaghan bombings of May 1974, in which 33 people were killed and over 200 injured. And this, of course, was an atrocity that was carried out by loyalist paramilitaries. But in actual fact, the vast majority of the increasing violence, increasing security concerns, and increasing challenge to the security services here in the South emanated from nationalist paramilitaries during the mid-1970s. So from between 1974 and 1977, this administration had to deal with prison breaks, some of which were successful, hunger strikes, increases in armed robberies by paramilitaries and terrorist groupings, high-profile kidnappings, threats indeed to kidnap the family members of cabinet ministers. There were also threats to the judiciary, some elements of the judiciary, and to some public servants, those who might have been involved in engaging with elements relating to counter-terrorist legislation during this time. And then there were also quite a number of attacks on the Irish police, the Garda or the Gardaí during this time, with a number being murdered by, again, nationalist, not loyalist, paramilitaries. There was also the murder in March 1974 of a member of our parliament, a man called Billy Fox, who was a member of the Fine Gael party. He was murdered by the Provisional IRA in March 1974. So these security issues had huge financial costs, and some could argue some societal costs for the state, but they certainly were a significant headache and a perennial issue for the government during this time. And arguably again led to the perception, or contributed to the perception of this government as a heavy law and order administration. Now, 1976 was actually the worst year from the government's perspective in relation to security issues. It was in that year that the British ambassador to Ireland, a man called Christopher Ewart Biggs, he, together with 3 other people, was travelling in his car, in his car from the British embassy, and the car was bombed by the Provisional IRA. An IED, a roadside bomb, was detonated by the Provisional IRA, killing the British ambassador outright, also killing another member of the consulate, a lady called Judith Cook, and the two other people in the car managed to escape with just injuries. But for obvious enough reasons, the government saw this as a significant challenge to the state. I mean, the ambassador of what was officially a friendly country had been murdered on their soil, and they responded robustly. The government responded robustly. A state of emergency was declared. This was the first time a state of emergency had been declared since the Second World War, and the government then proceeded to pass a number of very robust pieces of counter-terrorist legislation, which included or provided for increased powers for the Gardaí. It even allowed for, in certain specific circumstances, powers of arrest for the army to arrest civilians. But again, this would be in only very rare circumstances, but it was quite a move, if you will, away from the normal civil power having sole responsibility for arrest type of situation. And they also increased sentences for membership of illegal organisations quite significantly. Up until this point, if a person was convicted of membership of, say, the Provisional IRA, they could expect up to 2 years in prison. After this legislation was passed, they could expect up to 7 years in prison. And this is simply for membership, not necessarily if you haven't committed any other crime, but simply for being convicted of membership. And then another piece of legislation, the Emergency Powers Bill, this would allow for 7 days detention without charge for terrorist or subversive or paramilitary suspects. So to detain somebody of their right of freedom for 7 days without even charging them was a significant move. Up until that point, 2 days was the maximum. And so this was seen as a significant infringement on, or potential significant infringement on civil liberties by many of those who were concerned by this legislation. The government felt it was necessary, the Fianna Fáil opposition were unsure, and then there were many, as I say, in civic society who felt it was an undue infringement of civil liberties. And this included the President of Ireland at that time, a man called Carúil Ó Dáil. He was clearly of the view that the Emergency Powers Bill was dubious at best in terms of, from a moral perspective, and it's arguable he also felt it was constitutionally unsound, though there is some debate about whether he truly believed this, but he certainly gave the impression that he felt it was constitutionally unsound, so much so that he referred the bill to the Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court could assess its constitutionality. Now, ultimately, the Supreme Court declared it to be constitutional. In other words, irrespective of how robust or how unpleasant a piece of legislation it might be, it was in line with our Constitution and therefore was legal. But as a consequence, or partially as a consequence of this, the Minister for Defence at the time was to refer to the President as a thundering disgrace for having referred the legislation to the Supreme Court in the first place. Because from the government's perspective, it was an element of time wasting. In other words, for as long as the Supreme Court had to adjudicate on this legislation, it was not law and therefore could not be used against the kind of people who had murdered the British ambassador, or so the government logic would have gone. So the reference to O'Dáil by the Defence Minister as a thundering disgrace ultimately resulted in O'Dáil, the President, resigning, arguably because the minister was not fired by the government for this outrageous remark in which he referred publicly to the president as a thundering disgrace. No doubt the president, or one can imagine the president, expected the Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave to fire his minister if he didn't resign outright, Patrick Donegan. But whilst Patrick Donegan did offer to resign when he recognised the furore he created in the media over his outrageous statement, Liam Cosgrave told him, no, there's no need to resign, I'm paraphrasing, but there's no need to resign, just apologise to the president and we'll move on. This was Cosgrave's, I'm paraphrasing for effect, but that was his argument. The president would not accept this simple apology ultimately, and so the president resigned, in his own words, in order to uphold the dignity of the office. So this too has led to the general perception of this government as not just one focused on law and order, but also one which was prepared to be somewhat arrogant and somewhat disdainful of even the first citizen of the Irish state. However, that does leave out a significant amount of context in relation to this issue, because the received wisdom that you're likely to engage with if you read about this particular story or hear references in the media to the thundering disgrace, the debacle as it were, is effectively that a conscientious and well-meaning president who simply referred a bill to the Supreme Court in order to test its constitutionality was offended and was mistreated by both the Minister for Defence and by an arrogant government. But as I say, that leaves out a significant level of context because President O'Dáil had, during his tenure, exhibited what could only be charitably regarded as somewhat eccentric behaviour from time to time. So, for example, when he first became president, he indicated to a member of the Council of State, this is the body that the president can convene to consult with him on matters relating to legislation, he had indicated to a member of the Council of State that he intended to be a Republican president. And what exactly that meant, when we consider that previous presidents such as Sean Kealig, Eamon de Valera, or even Erskine Childers would probably have regarded themselves as Republican, it's unclear what President O'Dáil really meant by this statement, given the context of the time in which we had other organisations who were claiming to be Republican engaging in significant levels of violence. He also insisted on occasion, during meetings of the Council of State, of conducting as much business as possible through the medium of Irish, which again is an admirable enough quality, except if other members at the Council of State don't have any Irish or have only limited Irish, this was obviously going to hold up business and hold up meetings and probably irked other members of the Council of State, including the Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave, who would have been present at such meetings. Then in 1975, President O'Dáil was one of the first heads of state to address the European Parliament. And in his address to the European Parliament, he told a number of rather off-key jokes that probably went over the heads of some of the parliamentarians, including one joke in which the President, O'Dáil, imitated a barking dog. So one can imagine in the European Parliament how this went down, I think it's fair to say, and as a consequence it rather irked the government as well, given that he was their head of state that was giving this address. Then on a subsequent state visit to France, President O'Dáil, at least one press conference, insisted on only answering questions in Irish. So you can imagine the French reporters probably didn't know what he was saying. Most of the other international media men didn't know what he was saying. And it's probably true to say quite a few of the Irish journalists didn't know what the president was saying either. So again, this somewhat irked the government. Then, during one of the high-profile kidnappings I alluded to earlier, in this case a kidnapping in which a section of the Provisional IRA had kidnapped a Dutch industrialist who was resident in Ireland and were seeking certain considerations as a consequence from the government, it seems that President O'Dáil was considering offering himself as a substitute hostage so that the Dutch industrialists could be freed, and then President O'Dáil, whilst in the clutches, no doubt, of these subversives, might be able to talk them down and bring about a peaceful resolution to the issue. Now, no doubt this was a selfless consideration on President O'Dáil's part, but again, from the government's perspective, the idea of handing over your head of state to a group of armed paramilitaries it probably is not something they found particularly agreeable and were somewhat less than impressed with. And then at least one former Fianna Fáil minister, and remember, or I may not have mentioned, President O'Dáil had previously been a candidate for the Fianna Fáil party, and he had previously been an Attorney General for Fianna Fáil governments before moving on to become Chief Justice himself of the Supreme Court for a time. Well, President O'Dáil was regarded by some of his former Fianna Fáil colleagues as, in the words of one former Fianna Fáil minister, a bit of a crank. So there's a background to this issue, and it doesn't stop there, because with respect to the Emergency Powers Bill, which the President had referred to the Supreme Court, before he referred it to the Supreme, and of which the whole thundering disgrace issue emerged, before President O'Dáil had referred it to the Supreme Court, he had convened the Council of State to discuss the matter. And at the Council of State, there was the President's appointees or nominees, there was the current Taoiseach, there was former Taoiseach, and there was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the President of the High Court, or other major court here in Ireland. And whilst the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court opted to recuse himself from the conversation about the bill because he would be ultimately viewing it if the President chose to refer it, the President of the High Court, the highest judge of the High Court, he was clear in his view when he was advising the President, there's no need to send this bill to the Supreme Court, it's demonstrably constitutional. In effect, it would be time wasting to be sending it to the Supreme Court. But for his own reasons, O'Dáil chose to ignore, and we can also imagine that notwithstanding his lack of engagement on the part of the Chief Justice at this meeting, he was likely conferring with the President of the High Court prior to the meeting. So ultimately, President O'Dáil referred the legislation to the Supreme Court, and so this prolonged its time off the statute book, as it were. But then on the 15th of October, when the Chief Justice, Justice O'Higgins, returned from the Supreme Court, having deliberated and discussed the legislation, found it to be constitutional, he returned to the President and with the Supreme Court's judgment and indicated to the President he was now free to sign the bill into law. The President then refused to sign the bill into law immediately because in the intervening period he had consulted the Constitution and he discovered, the President, that the Irish language version in our Constitution, which does legally take precedence over the English language version, seemed to indicate that the President was under no obligation to sign a bill that returns from the Supreme Court until the day after the Supreme Court's judgment. So this might seem a little eccentric, but okay. So the President indicated he was not going to sign the bill until after midnight the following morning, as it were. The problem was the President made this known publicly. At roughly the same time then, or what is many believed to have been desired to be occurring at roughly the same time, the Provisional IRA, who obviously were not in favourably disposed towards this bill, which was naturally going to affect their members potentially quite significantly, they lured a number of Gardaí to a house in County Laois on the pretence that there was a domestic dispute in the house. And when a number of Gardaí tried to enter the house, a booby trap device was set off. One Garda, Michael Clerkin, was murdered or killed immediately, and another, Garda Peters, was maimed for life. This was widely seen at the time, as I say, as a reaction by the Provisional IRA to the Emergency Powers Act, and timed, in effect, potentially anyway, at any rate, to occur at the same time as the President's declared public signing. And this, ladies and gentlemen, forms a greater degree of the context to Paddy Donegan's outrageous, I agree, remark to refer to the President as a thundering disgrace. And it's probably a context you're not likely to receive or to see within much of the received wisdom and references to it in the public domain. But in any event, irrespective of who was right, who was wrong, and certainly the reference to the President as a thundering disgrace was wrong, that Donegan should not have said it. Whether or not Cosgrave should have fired his minister again is a matter open for debate, but ultimately I think it's fair to say the entire event did damage the perception of the government to a certain extent, because O'Dáil's resignation did lead to something of a brief constitutional crisis before Patrick Hillery stepped into the breach and became our next president. Now, in terms of decreasing popularity, there's also an argument to be made that media coverage during this period of the coalition's tenure in power also chipped away at their popularity within the electorate. But this also included visual media presentations of this government during this time. And for any of you who are familiar with these images here, this is an image of what's generally known as the Ballymagash Council in what was in a programme that was on RTE, on Irish television, known as Hall's Pictorial Weekly. And the Hall's Pictorial Weekly satirised many elements of Irish society, but in particular it satirised the sitting government and to a lesser extent the opposition as well. But there's no doubt, and if any of you have the opportunity to ever watch episodes of Hall's Pictorial Weekly, I can highly recommend it. It's quite entertaining, particularly if you're into political history, of course. But there's no doubt that some of the characters who became famous, such as the Minister for Hardship, who always was telling the people how lucky they are to have it so bad, essentially. There's no doubt that he was largely based on the Taoiseach, and everyone who was watching the programme knew that this character, the Minister for Hardship, was based on the Taoiseach. And there's an argument to be made that much like social media today, if you watch something enough that gives you an indication that somebody is a dour and difficult individual that wants to make your life more difficult, then you might eventually start to believe it. So there's probably an argument to be made, I think, that the regular satirisation of this government by Hall's Pictorial Weekly, but it was very funny now, I have to say, it was very, very entertaining, may well have had a negative impact on its popularity as we approach the 1977 general election. And there are some who have claimed that Frank Hall, the man who edited and oversaw Hall's Pictorial Weekly, was somewhat sympathetic to Fianna Fáil as well. He disclaimed this now, he deprecated this notion later on. He simply said that the characters, the people who were in the National Coalition, the cabinet of all the talents, they were just more entertaining. They got up to more things than the Fianna Fáil contingent. And so that's the reason why after this government left power, according to Frank Hall, after this government left power, the reason why Hall's Pictorial Weekly became apparently much less sharp and much less cutting with respect to the subsequent Fianna Fáil government was due to the presence of better characters in the coalition government. But again, one can have their views on that if they wish. But there's no doubt that there was some standout characters in that government, and certainly there were some standout avatars in Hall's Pictorial Weekly. Okay. So as we're approaching then the eve of essentially the 1977 general election, many in the government, including particularly the Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave, was becoming quite exacerbated. He felt that his government, the coalition government, had faced down economic crises and all the difficulty and unpopularity that attends to that, and they were facing down a significant security threat from multiple actually groups of paramilitaries in a way. There was groups like the Provisional IRA, the Irish National Liberation Army, and then some splinter groups from these elements as well. So by the time we got to the May 1977 Ardèche of the Fine Gael party, so this Ardèche was held just literally about a week before the election was called, Liam Cosgrave let vent his rage essentially with the media, or certain sections of the media who were castigating the government, and the critics in general of the government. Though there is an added context here. It was late 1976 and early 1977 in which the Irish Times, I believe, began to break a series of stories in relation to alleged mistreatment of paramilitary prisoners while in custody by members of An Garda Síochána. And there were repeated stories and repeated claims in relation to this, which the government deprecated entirely. So the government basically claimed that this was entirely a paramilitary conspiracy to try and undermine the integrity and the morale of the Gardaí and to try to undermine the public's trust in An Garda Síochána, in our police force, and the government essentially dismissed any notion that any of these allegations were true. Now, as the years have progressed since, I think it's quite clear there's at least sufficient evidence, in my view, to indicate that some of these allegations, in fact, almost certainly have some truth to them, almost certainly. Whether or not all the allegations that were being made in the late 1970s are true, that's open for debate, but there was, it seems pretty clear now based on the evidence that there was mistreatment of prisoners in certain circumstances. Or of suspects, I apologise, in certain circumstances. But at this time, the government was denying this completely, with the consequence then that at the Ardèche, in a haranguing speech to his assembled party grandees, but also the party faithful, he was to claim there is a malicious campaign of vilification and it has been conducted in one newspaper against the Garda and the prison service. The great thing in vogue with some of these commentators and writers is civil rights. What civil rights did Garret Fáil have, or Garret Reynolds get? These were two Gardaí who had been murdered by paramilitaries. Before Cosgrave went on, not for the first time has this party stood between the people of this country and anarchy. And remember, those people who comment so freely and write so freely, some of them aren't even Irish. No doubt many of you are familiar with an expression in some parts of the country where an outsider is described as a blow-in. Some of these commentators are blow-ins. Now, as far as we're concerned, they can blow out or blow up. And there was a significant response, a positive response at the assembled hall amongst the Fine Gael contingent to these strong words. But for reasons that I think we can all understand, it did not go over very well in the media or with any of the opposition parties, or indeed with substantial sections of the public at large. It was seen as a rather aggressive, unnecessarily militant type of speech, and indeed the one commentator in the Irish Times subsequently was to claim that it was well to the right of anything that any Irish party leader had attempted since the 1930s. Now, it's also widely believed that when Cosgrave was referring to some of these commentators not being Irish and being blow-ins, his main target here was this man, a man called Bruce Arnold, who was an English-born journalist, but who worked in Ireland and was at that time working for the Irish Times and was quite critical for over a concerted period of time of the government's approach in various areas, in particular with respect to security issues. So it's widely believed that, therefore, this was an attack as well then on a member of the press, on a member of our journalistic community, which again did not go down well, understandably, with many journalists, and indeed was not well received by what you could call the liberal wing. Do you remember in the last lecture I mentioned that Fine Gael had a liberal wing somewhat and a conservative wing, and that the liberal wing had issues with Cosgrave from quite early on and had sought to displace him indeed potentially? Well, that wing, the liberal wing, rather represented by Dr. Garret FitzGerald, for example, were not impressed with this approach by Cosgrave either. And indeed, I believe some of them went to Bruce Arnold subsequently and apologised to him in person, I think. So, by the time then we get to, effectively, the 1977 general election, this administration is one that is perhaps seen by some to be limping towards the finish line. It was understandably drained, you could say, from 4 years of economic challenges and significant security concerns. There was a low morale, really, amongst both the activist bases of the Fine Gael party and the Labour Party, the coalition partner of Fine Gael at this time. It's arguable that both organisations, both the Labour Party and the Fine Gael party, had somewhat lethargic organisational structures, because they had been left in abeyance or left to rust, as it were, to a certain extent, while the leadership of these two parties had faced these challenges in government. And then, as I say, the government itself was viewed rather negatively by some, not the entire media, but by some sections within the media during this time. Now, in contrast to this, the Fianna Fáil party, which had been in opposition since March 1973, was moving towards the 1977 general election, revitalised and reorganised. Under its new General Secretary, a man called Séamus Brennan, Fianna Fáil had very much set about reorganising its activist base and its even so much so its internal communication systems since in 1973 to make it more effective. Brennan had actually travelled to the United States to see how election campaigns were conducted there, and he was present for Jimmy Carter's election campaign as well and saw how successful that had been, and he took note of and studied the approaches of the American Democratic Party during its election campaign during that time, and then he brought those observations and that analysis back home here and funneled it into what was now a revitalised Fianna Fáil organisation. Under Séamus Brennan as well, this Fianna Fáil also began to make significant use of opinion poll data. Now, for those of you who are interested in politics, today opinion polls are like breakfast cereal for most of us. We're consuming them day in, day out, and we always want to know what the latest one is. But in the Ireland of the 1970s, opinion polls were still rather in their infancy and were very much distrusted by a substantial section of the political hierarchy. quite a lot of politicians simply didn't believe what opinion polls said. They preferred to believe what their local constituents told them on the street or in a letter, etc. But Fianna Fáil were coming to the conclusion at this point that opinion poll data was something that could be harnessed and utilised, and they did so under Seamus Brennan's guidance. And then Fianna Fáil, recognising as they did that since 1973 there had been a substantial increase in the youth demographic here in Ireland, with a corresponding substantial increase in the number of young people who were eligible to vote come the 1977 election. If you recall in our last lecture, I mentioned that as a consequence of either the cynical or the deft, depending your perspective, approach of Jack Lynch just prior to the 73 election, in which he held the election before a significant number of 18 to 21-year-olds would be able to vote, because he thought they would vote against Fianna Fáil, so he held the election before they could get on the electoral register under a new law. Well, all these lads and ladies were now coming to the fore and were preparing to vote in 1977. So Fianna Fáil very much engaged in attempted to court, depending on your pronunciation, the youth vote in the run-up to the 1977 election. However, despite all these apparent negativities accruing to the coalition and all these challenges that we're now likely to face in the run-up to the 1977 election, there was still a widespread view that the coalition was actually going to win the 1977 election. There was a widespread view amongst the politicians of both parties, of all three parties arguably, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, as well as amongst the vast majority of the political commentariat in the media, that the coalition were still going to win. And that many of its current candidates would return to office, but indeed they might even increase their majority, was the perception on the part of some political commentators. And those of you who there might recognise the youthful and vibrant figure here of our former president, Michael D. Higgins. He was also a candidate for the Labour Party in the upcoming, at that time, 1977 election. So as I say, there was a general view that the coalition might actually win. And there was a couple of reasons why this, understandable reasons to an extent, why this view was pervasive. So first of all, during the tenure of this coalition, 73 to 77, there had been a number of by-election victories for the coalition. There were 7 by-elections in total during the tenure of this government. 3 of those by-elections were won by the opposition party Fianna Fáil. 1 was won by a grouping known as Independent Fianna Fáil, which was obviously a split from Fianna Fáil and was run by Neil Blaney of the arms crisis fame. But 3 of the 7 by-elections were won by the coalition. And again, those of you who are keen followers of politics will know it's not easy for a government to win a by-election. But they won 3 out of the 7 in the teeth of economic depression, security difficulties, and 2 of these by-elections were won in the latter part, effectively, of the tenure of this government, including one by-election which was won here by, again, another youthful figure here, Enda Kenny. Some of you may recognise him. He later became leader of the Fine Gael party and Taoiseach. So given the success of the government in a number of by-elections, including towards the latter part of this tenure, there was a belief that perhaps the omens were good. Indeed, in one by-election, the latter one in 1976, it was won by the Labour Party and they took the seat from Fianna Fáil in 1976. So as I say, there was this view that maybe all is not lost. Or not only that, but in fact all is to gain in actual fact. Now, in addition to that then, by the start of 1977, the economic situation had started to turn around. There was improvement in the economy. The impact of the oil crisis was starting to dissipate, and there was clear signs of an economic upturn here in Ireland, with the consequence that even Richie Ryan, the then Minister for Finance, who up until that point had often been referred to as Richie Ruin because of the hair shirt budgets he'd been introducing, he was actually able to introduce a more popular budget in January 1977, or at least a less unpopular one at any rate. So this was seen as a positive. And then lastly, the government was seen by the commentators to have an ace in their pocket, as it were, and this was the Tullymander. So the term the Tullymander is obviously a play on the gerrymander, and it relates to the Minister for Local Government, Jimmy Tully, who had at that time the Minister for Local Government would have responsibility for redrawing constituencies in the state, electoral constituencies. So in 1974, he introduced a new set of constituencies, essentially, for any forthcoming election, which was clearly designed to maximise the potential for the coalition to be returned to government. So what James Tully did was he decreased the number of 5- and 4-seater constituencies, for example, particularly in the Dublin area, and replaced them with 3-seater constituencies. And indeed, he created 13 new 3-seater constituencies in the Dublin area alone. And based on the demographics, coupled with the voting pattern of 1973, which had benefited the coalition, remember, it was estimated by James Tully, by the government, and by virtually everybody else, that in the event of an election, what would happen is, in most of these 3-seat constituencies, Fianna Fáil would win 1 seat, Fine Gael would win 1 seat, and the Labour Party would win 1 seat. So that's 2-1 for the coalition in all of these 3-seat, or most of these 3-seat constituencies. So this, together with some other changes, prompted a number of political commentators to conclude that there was a not unreasonable possibility that in the next election of 1977, Fine Gael could get up to 60 seats, and the Labour Party could get up to 24 seats on a very good day, granted, but still anything up to those 2 sets of seats, giving a significant and comfortable overall majority. So as I say, this was seen as the ace in the pocket, and convinced many then, as I say, within both the political ferment and within the general commentariat, that it was going to be a coalition win. With the consequence then, not the consequence, but as it would transpire, the election was called in by Liam Cosgrave he dissolved the Dáil in May of 1977, just a few days actually after his audacious, if you will, or obnoxious if you're the other perspective, Ardèche speech, and he dissolved the Dáil and called the general election for the 16th of June. Now, the election didn't have to happen at this point in June. The government had only run 4.5 years at this stage. He could have held on for at least another 6 to 9 months, arguably. The Taoiseach, and there was a split within the cabinet on the issue of when to hold the election. Broadly speaking, the urban ministers in cabinet, people like Dr. FitzGerald, Richie Ryan, Justin Keating, etc., they were plumping for a later election in the autumn of 1977 to give more time for the positive economic signals to percolate throughout the electorate and to hopefully result in a better outcome for the coalition. But some of the more rural-based ministers were anxious for an earlier election before the summer hit proper, because they were concerned just simply something worse could go wrong, because things tend to do between now and the autumn. And there was also always a concern in case the harvest might fail, and this would be the government would be blamed for the harvest failing. It's just what always happens. Take my word for it. So these were contributory factors to the debate, and whilst it was believed by many that Cosgrave's conservative instincts would lead him to call the election for the autumn rather than to have an earlier one and to wait for the economic scenario to further improve. He actually called a June election, and part of the reason for that was to do with internal difficulties in the Labour Party. If you recall, in our last lecture I indicated that Labour had differing views within the party on various matters, including the principle of coalition with Fine Gael itself. There was a pro-coalitionist element in Labour and an anti-coalitionist element. And by 1977, the anti-coalitionist and somewhat, in some respects, further left element of the Labour Party were becoming very disgruntled with being in government with Fine Gael, and were disgruntled with the direction of the leadership of the party to a certain extent. And there was fear within the leadership of the party of splits, essentially. And at one point then, and to further confirm this, at one point Liam Cosgrave explained to Richie Ryan, the Minister for Finance, his reason for deciding to go for an early election. He said, Corish came to me, because Corish was the leader of the Labour Party, Corish came to me earlier in the week and he is wobbling like a jellyfish. He says the Labour Party might not stick together over the summer, and if we don't go now for an election, the government could collapse over Labour's internal squabbles. So, because it has been a long established question, if you will, within those interested in this period of history. Why did Cosgrave call Cosgrave called the election in June. Why didn't he wait? So I think a significant factor was, in fact, the issues within the Labour Party, and he wanted to forestall them for his colleague and friend at this point, Brendan Corish, his Taoiseach and leader of the Labour Party. Okay, so then the early coalition campaign then, because you can break down this campaign from the coalition's perspective into early and late. So the early coalition campaign was somewhat lacklustre. They quite simply, despite calling the election in June, and despite having the power to call the election, and despite Cosgrave obviously being the one who decided when the election would be, they simply weren't ready for the election, to be quite frank. So when the election was called, the coalition was quite slow to get the gears and mechanisms of their electoral processes moving. And the early part of the campaign on their part was somewhat lacklustre, and as we shall see, it certainly lacked the professionalism of the Fianna Fáil campaign. Both government parties tended, as government parties often do, to emphasise their record, the record over the last number of years. And of course, as again most parties often do in Irish elections, as we've seen, they argued that you should return us to power in order to maintain stable government. There was also a significant emphasis on law and order issues on the part of coalition candidates at the start of the campaign, with people such as Cosgrave himself, and from the Labour Party side, Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien being the most vociferous proponents of this law and order ethic. They weren't the only ones, but they were certainly amongst the most vociferous during the early part of the campaign. They regularly attacked Fianna Fáil's earlier record with respect to Northern Ireland and with respect to paramilitarism, and they also attacked Fianna Fáil's recent official call for a declaration of British intent to withdraw from Northern Ireland. This was a policy that was adopted, a rhetorical policy that was adopted by Fianna Fáil in the mid-1970s, that they would declare that Britain should, that Fianna Fáil argued that Britain should declare their intention to withdraw at some stage from Northern Ireland. But it was largely rhetorical in nature. But again, the Fine Gael and Labour parties attacked Fianna Fáil on this basis, claiming that it serves no purpose and only antagonises unionists unnecessarily, etc. And then Charles Haughey, a man we mentioned several times in the last lecture, Charles Haughey, a member of Fianna Fáil, was singled out for particular attack by Conor Cruise O'Brien, who was his constituency rival in Dublin during that time. So there's an argument to be made that the initial focus on law and order by the coalition was counterproductive, that it didn't do the coalition any favour during the campaign, that the electorate were turned off by an argument on law and order issues, because at this stage the electorate, much like the electorate of 1973, were focused on bread and butter issues. And as some of you may have already noted, for who might have attended the last lecture, what was occurring here was already the inverse or the converse of what had occurred in 1973. If you recall, in the 1973 election, it was Fianna Fáil in the initial part of their campaign as the outgoing government that focused on law and order issues, whilst the putative coalition of Fine Gael and Labour had argued on bread and butter issues. The converse was to be the case in this instance. And with respect to Conor Cruise O'Brien, we can be fairly certain his attacks on Charles Haughey, however accurate or inaccurate they may have been, were counterproductive for Conor Cruise O'Brien, as he would ultimately lose his seat in that election, and Charles Haughey would continue on to bigger and better things, as it were. Now, the campaign of the coalition was also impacted somewhat by the splinters, the splits, and in some respects the sideswipes within the Labour Party itself. So if you recall, I mentioned already the Labour Party had internal issues, part of which no doubt contributed to Cosgrave's decision to call the election when he did. But even once the election campaign was taking place, some of these internal squabbles started to come to the fore. So some of you might recognise this lady here, or this man here, first of all, Noel Browne. He was a member of the Labour Party at this stage. Noel Browne had been a member of many parties, but at this stage he was a member of the Labour Party, but he was a strongly anti-coalitionist member of the Labour Party. He was not in favour of Labour's coalescing with Fine Gael. With the consequence then that when he was selected by his local constituency colleagues to be placed on the ballot paper for the Labour Party, the party leadership stepped in to push him off the ballot paper essentially, and effectively he was pushed out of the party, with the result that Browne ran as an independent anti-coalitionist Labour candidate, if you follow my meaning. He was not a member of the official Labour Party then for this election. Meanwhile, this lady here, who some of you will recognise, are rather youthful at this stage, Mary Robinson, who would later become President of Ireland, Presidents come and go very quickly in my lectures, as you can see here. They're often popping up in and out from time to time. Well, she was a member of the Labour Party at this stage, and she was placed onto the ballot paper, essentially, or put onto the ballot paper by the leadership of the Labour Party in her particular constituency, much to the annoyance of many of the local activists in the constituency at that time, who felt that this was undermining those who had been working on the ground, as it were, for many years, with the consequence that the already selected Labour candidate in that constituency resigned from recused himself essentially from being the candidate for Labour in that election, essentially left the party, crossed the river and started working in Noel Brown's campaign. So obviously there were not insignificant internal difficulties within the Labour Party, which were primarily in Dublin, but there were also elsewhere as well, which was to, I think, undermine the morale of the Labour campaign at this stage, and was of little benefit, obviously, to the coalition. So as I alluded to, in contrast then, the Fianna Fáil campaign got off to a flying start. Remember I mentioned it was the coalition campaign was so lacklustre, it was almost as if they didn't know the election that they were calling was coming. Whereas Fianna Fáil, on the very first day that the election was called, launched a manifesto. The first time that Fianna Fáil had ever launched a manifesto, I might add, and it was a new departure indeed for all political parties in many respects in Irish politics at that time. And it was, you can see it there, it was a full colour, glossy manifesto. So this came across very well or appeared very well from an aesthetic perspective for much of the electorate. And the brains, as it were, or one of the prime architects behind what became the Fianna Fáil manifesto, at least on the economic side, was this man here, Martin O'Donoghue, an academic himself, as it happens, and subsequently a candidate in that election. But up until this point, he was the economic advisor for Jack Lynch, the leader of Fianna Fáil. So the manifesto was very well received by the electorate on the campaign trail, and why wouldn't it? In this manifesto, Fianna Fáil promised that they would abolish the wealth tax, which, to be fair, wasn't all that popular anyway. They also promised to abolish motor tax, or tax on cars. That was obviously welcome. They indicated that they would, upon re-election, immediately abolish the domestic rates. And I think I did mention this in the last lecture, because Fianna Fáil had also thrown that in as a Hail Mary at the end of the 1973 general election, in which they were promising to abolish the rates on domestic dwellings that homeowners had to pay in order to help fund local government. But they were unpopular, but some might argue they were necessary, but they were certainly unpopular. And Fianna Fáil promised to abolish the domestic rates and to recoup what the local government coffers needed from the central exchequer. Fianna Fáil also promised grants of up to £1,000 for first-time buyers. They promised to expand significantly the employment in the public service so as to help reduce the spiralling unemployment that we were experiencing as a consequence of the aftermath of the oil crisis. And the overall argument of Fianna Fáil at this time was that the coalition had mishandled the economy, that the recession was still continuing, and what was required was a significant financial stimulus, even if that necessitated additional borrowing, in order to get the economy back up and running again. And as the late Professor Dermot Keogh, the biographer of Jack Lynch, has indicated, it was a manifesto that put money, or had the potential to put money, in the pocket of every member of the electorate. Now, in addition to that, the Fianna Fáil campaign itself, aside from the manifesto, was dynamic. It was very much a presidential type campaign, focusing on the very popular and amiable Jack Lynch as the leader of this revitalised and reorganised Fianna Fáil machine. And there were a lot of Fianna Fáil slogans were introduced by Fianna Fáil during this campaign, slogans such as "Bring back Jack," "Put Jack back." And then in what was clearly a carryover from what Seamus Brennan must have witnessed in America, there were even baseball caps distributed to various supporters and stalwarts of the party with the caption, "Get ahead with Fianna Fáil." And then there was also a very catchy musical track which was produced by Fianna Fáil for this election itself, which was, the title was "Let's Make It Your Kind of Country." And again, taste can vary, I accept, but if you listen to it, you can see it's catchy. certainly was catchy for the island at the time and probably did help to appeal to the youth vote as well, which, as I think I alluded to already, had expanded quite significantly in the intervening years since the last election. And again, thinking back to the 1973 election, the converse was the case. Fianna Fáil basically not ignored Northern Ireland, but did not focus on Northern Ireland issues and essentially avoided focusing heavily on security issues, focusing steadily on bread and butter issues. In other words, to borrow a phrase from over the water, it was the economy, stupid, essentially. And so Fianna Fáil focused on economic matters, and this definitely was well received by the electorate. With the consequence then that about a week or so, or a little bit more than a week into the campaign, the coalition parties finally coming to the conclusion that they needed to engage with opinion polling, commissioned their own opinion poll, which indicated, this was the opinion poll commissioned privately for the coalition, it indicated that 59% of people were going to vote for Fianna Fáil, and less than 35% were going to vote for the two coalition parties taken together. And then there was also an Irish Times poll on the 2nd of June, which indicated that for the electorate, prices, inflation, tax and unemployment, they were the important issues for the electorate, ranging between 54% and 76% depending on the issue, whereas security in Northern Ireland was only 20% each in terms of the level of importance for the electorate. And this is what the coalition had been focusing on. So when they saw these polling numbers, one member of the coalition at the time, Dr. Garret FitzGerald, was to lament, with his tongue in his cheek, but nevertheless, can we undissolve the Dáil? In other words, can we go back and just have an autumn election, essentially? Because based on these numbers of 59%, the coalition were bound to lose. So as a consequence, the coalition then adapts, at least to a certain extent, its approach in the latter part of the campaign. And indeed, the coalition began to engage to a certain extent in what could be called auction politics. They tried to match Fianna Fáil to a certain extent on some of the spending issues, and promised to also to reduce domestic rates by 75%, with the intention for a total abolition within 2 years of domestic rates. They didn't promise to immediately abolish them, just like Fianna Fáil, because again, from the coalition's point of view, they weren't sure if this was actually fiscally possible. But they did promise to reduce rates significantly and ultimately abolish them in the longer term. They also promised then to reduce unemployment to 80,000 within 2 years by also expanding essentially employment within the public service or within state enterprises. But despite this, as I say, this adaptation by the coalition in the latter part of the campaign, one member of the government, Michael O'Leary, a member of the Labour Party, he later said that they still wanted to avoid what's known as a Dutch auction, and didn't want to have a straight battle with Fianna Fáil in this auction politics type scenario. Whereas another member of the government at that time, Justin Keating, also a Labour Party man, he was to regard the Fianna Fáil manifesto as reckless, and so therefore he said, we had to trust the public that they would not be deceived by Fianna Fáil. As a government, we knew we had to try to be serious, not to make grand promises without costing them out properly. It would have been nice to have produced a package like Fianna Fáil's, but no government in its right mind, knowing what the economy had come through since the Middle East war, could have been as reckless as that, as reckless as Fianna Fáil appeared to be, according to Justin Keating. However, others in the coalition camp, such as Liam Cosgrave and, of course, Conor Cruise O'Brien, they continued to focus on the law and order issue, on the stable government issue in the last week of the campaign. Cosgrave, too, was taken with a bout of laryngitis towards the end of the campaign, which didn't help either. The leader was out of commission for a time, as it were. However, nevertheless, by the time we got to the very final week of the campaign, opinion polling indicated that they had clawed back some, the coalition had clawed back a little. Fianna Fáil's popularity for the first preference vote appeared to be down to 51%, so maybe there was still a chance from the coalition's perspective. However, Lynch, there's no doubt, was harnessing a mood for change. And in the final election rally, I believe, in Cork, just before polling day, he was to indicate to the crowd, the immediate issues for many in this election are prices and unemployment. But there is more than that involved. There is a question of national confidence. We have been getting the same kind of response everywhere, essentially, from the people, change. And as we all know, change is a very popular term. So then in terms of the others during the election campaign, we won't need to focus long because there was really only one other party of note that ran in this campaign, and that was what was known as Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party. They were the old official Sinn Féin. They ran in a very much a left-wing perspective once again, as they had in 1973, argued for universal healthcare, and also, of course, arguing for a British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. They also advocated the nationalisation of the banks and ownership of various, up until this point, large private enterprises as well. They ran 16 candidates, the Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, but none were elected. And then in terms of the others, again, you have Noel Brown there, as I mentioned already, who was running as an anti-coalition Labour man. And then you had various independents, including independent Fianna Fáil, the effective leader of which was Neil Blaney, a former Fianna Fáil man himself. But overall, they're, for reasons that would become obvious in a moment, their impact in the election was marginal enough. Both the Coalition and Fianna Fáil did try to, if you'll forgive the use of the term, to court the women's vote during this time. There have been a significant increase in certain civic society groups to try and emphasise the importance of getting women onto the ballot paper and then getting people to vote for women on the ballot paper during this time. And both the Coalition and Fianna Fáil had a bit of a to and fro, as it were, over the issue of women's rights and who was better for women's rights, as it were, with Fianna Fáil claiming that the Coalition discriminates against women, but Fianna Fáil will put that right, as you can see there. Meanwhile, in what was arguably one of the more deft moves on the part of the Fine Gael side of the Coalition at this time, they responded essentially to the Fianna Fáil attacks by issuing excerpts from various interviews they engaged with women who were all castigating essentially Fianna Fáil's propaganda and claiming that we've got a good government for women essentially, well for everyone, but for women in this case, let's keep it. Okay, now the media coverage. Well, unlike in some of our previous lectures or some of our previous time periods in our earlier lectures, there was much less partisan behaviour on the part of the various news outlets during this election and during this time. Remember, it was the tendency in the past that the Irish press would support Fianna Fáil and the Irish Independent tended to vote Cumann na Gael, Fine Gael, and the Irish Times could kind of go either way, but generally went for Cumann na Gael, Fine Gael as well in terms of its editorial regime and its editorial support. But by this stage, the media was becoming much more savvy, I think, in this regard. So whilst some individual journalists were castigating one side or the other, the editorial regimes at the various news outlets were much more balanced, I think it's fair to say. Although the Irish press, with its obvious traditional and family ties to Fianna Fáil indeed, they were to indicate at the end of the campaign, Fianna Fáil have conducted one of their best ever campaigns. Mr. Jack Lynch will come out of this election with his reputation enhanced, irrespective of the result. But still, on election day, on election day itself, it was still the general view of most media commentators, the Coalition are set to take the election. This was the claim by the Irish Times. And indeed, one RTE correspondent at the time, a man called Sean Dignan, who would have been, I think, known to have had Fianna Fáil sympathies certainly later because he became a press secretary for a Fianna Fáil government. He was to state, if Fianna Fáil win it, it will be the greatest comeback since Lazarus. But Lazarus is exactly what arrived, because on election day, it became clear very quickly that Fianna Fáil were not only going to win this election, but they were going to win it handsomely. And as the election results began to come in on the 17th of June, the election was on the 16th of June, so as the results started to come in early enough on the 16th of June, it became apparent in the various constituency areas that Fianna Fáil were going to romp home. The tallymen were able to return their verdict that Fianna Fáil were set for an overall majority. The only question was, how high was it going to be? And indeed, by the end of the evening, the extent to which it was clear that Fianna Fáil were obviously going to win the election, the Taoiseach himself conceded the election effectively that evening. Live on television, Liam Cosgrave accepted that when the new Dáil meets on the 5th of July, there will be a change of government. So not even all the votes had yet been counted, not all the seats had been allocated by 9 p.m. the following day. There were still quite a few to go officially to be allocated, but the trend was obvious, so much so that the Taoiseach himself conceded that the election was over. This was only the second time that the Taoiseach had conceded on the day, effectively, or the day after an election or during a count. Normally, you'd at least wait till you got to Parliament, see how the figures might work out. But in this case, no, he accepted that the game was up. And the reasons why subsequently then were obvious in terms of the percentage. Fianna Fáil received close to 51% of the first preference vote. So they received a majority outright of the first preference vote, with Fine Gael down 4.6% to 30% of the vote, and the Labour Party down 2% to 11% of the vote. Now, what this transferred into, however, was something somewhat unusual in a way. So Fianna Fáil received over 50% of the vote on a swing towards them of 4.4%, but they returned with 15 extra seats, a total of 84 seats, and an overall majority of 20 seats. This was a 20-seat overall majority. And Fine Gael, losing only 4% or so, with 4.6% of the vote, lost 12 seats. So the disparity here is answered ultimately by the Tullymander that I mentioned earlier. Because of the way that the constituency boundaries have been organised, if you recall, I mentioned the view was that if the voting pattern had remained roughly similar to 1973, the coalition would win 2 seats to every one in the 3-seat constituencies. They would win 2 seats to Fianna Fáil's 1 in each of those 3-seat constituencies. But because of the swing of the vote to Fianna Fáil of just over 50%, the converse occurred. It actually meant now that in those 3-seat constituencies, Fianna Fáil returned with 2 seats to 1 for each, or either of one or other of the coalition parties. So the careful calibration of the constituencies by Tully had actually accentuated, it had exaggerated the Fianna Fáil success and had been even more detrimental to the coalition. So what had been intended to benefit the coalition had the opposite effect. With a consequence then that, as I say, on the on a percentage, first preference percentage vote of just about 51%, Jack Lynch returned with the highest overall majority in the history of the state, with the result then that on the 5th of July, Jack Lynch was back in power, leading a very large Fianna Fáil parliamentary party into government as Taoiseach once again. But of course, the question would quickly emerge, Jack might be back, but who was watching his back and who might be prepared to stab him in the back? Because one of those who also returned, obviously, with the Fianna Fáil party at this time into government was Charles Haughey, who I think I alluded to in the last lecture, had managed to rehabilitate himself within Fianna Fáil in the intervening period and was attempting to bolster his position and to effect his leadership ambitions. And whilst there were many who felt at the time of this election, with Jack Lynch returning with a 20-seat majority, that his position as leader of Fianna Fáil was now unassailable, Haughey felt somewhat and did differently about this. And this lady here, Geraldine Kennedy, she was a political reporter at the time, subsequently would be the editor of the Irish Times. She saw Haughey on election night when the results were coming in, and it was clear that Jack Lynch was going to get a thumping overall majority. And she and others were of the view that surely this will undermine Haughey's leadership ambitions. He won't be able to displace Jack Lynch now from the leadership of Fianna Fáil. But Haughey was smiling. Haughey was happy. And when Geraldine Kennedy said to him, "I don't know what you're so happy about. It's obvious Jack Lynch is on his way to a historic 84 seats. You know, your chances of being leader, obviously this is the implication, your chances of being leader are now substantially decreased." To which Haughey responded, "Now I know I will be leader, because they're all my people." Because quite a lot of the new, fresh faces that came in to the parliamentary party for Fianna Fáil after 1977 were people were new TDs, people that Haughey had engaged himself with and had manufactured significant degree of friendship and camaraderie with during his time in the political wilderness within Fianna Fáil in the mid-1970s. Okay. So the consequences of the 1977 election then, well, one of the first immediate consequences was the high-profile casualties and the leadership changes that there were at this time. So in terms of high-profile casualties, immediately after the election, essentially both Liam Cosgrave and Brendan Corish, the leaders of Fine Gael and the Labour Party respectively, they both resigned as the leaders of their particular parties. Now, they didn't necessarily have to resign. Cosgrave could probably have held on for a while. There may have been a challenge from Garret FitzGerald perhaps, but Cosgrave probably had sufficient loyalty within Fine Gael that he could have held on, but he chose that now was the right time for him to step back as leader of Fine Gael. Similarly with Brendan Corish, despite the significant degree of disgruntlement within sections of the Labour Party over the direction of the leadership, there wasn't the same level of cutthroat desire to take down the leader and to become leader in the Labour Party back then, as there arguably has been in more recent years. And so, as a consequence, Corish could probably have held on as well. But after 17 years at the helm there, he too, I think he felt it was time to step back. So you had two leaders immediately resigning in the aftermath of this election. But there were other casualties. Justin Keating, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, lost his seat. Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien, the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, lost his seat. The Minister for Justice, arguably one of the most high-profile positions in the Cabinet, particularly during the difficult years of the security issues that were occurring here, Paddy Cooney, lost his seat. And then this man here, who was not a member of the Cabinet, but was a high-profile intellectual within the Labour Party, a man called David Thornley, I mentioned him, I think, in the last lecture, he also lost his seat. So there was a lot of high-profile casualties amongst not just the coalition parties, but even amongst the ministers of this government at this time. There were also a number of future power players and future Taoiseach elected then during this same election. Some might recognise a youthful and vibrant and sometimes brash Pádraig Flynn here. He was later an important minister in Fianna Fáil governments and later a European Commissioner. He was first elected in 1977. Others may recognise a young Bertie Ahern here, future Taoiseach. He was elected for Fianna Fáil first time in 1977. Charlie McCreevy, a future Minister for Finance and a European Commissioner as well, elected for the first time for Fianna Fáil in this election. And then another future Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, elected for the first time for Fianna Fáil in 1977. Oh, and then I already mentioned Martin O'Donoghue. He would become an important minister in the subsequent Lynch government. This was his first time to be elected as well. So a lot of future power players and future Taoiseach were elected in this contest. Now, another immediate consequence of this election was the decision of the subsequent government to no longer allow a gerrymander or a tullymander to occur again. So soon after returning to power, Jack Lynch's government changed the law with respect to the revision of constituencies, and the process of revising constituencies for elections was given to an independent commission. In the longer term context, then another consequence of this election was that it confirmed what was probably already an emerging trend towards auction politics here in Ireland. And whether or not auction politics is obviously an expression of democracy. Whether or not it's a positive one is open for debate, but I think there's no doubt that the 1977 election, given the nature of the Fianna Fáil manifesto, but so too some of the responses by the coalition to that manifesto in the latter part of the campaign, in which they did try to engage in a little bit of auction politics, I think it's fair to say, it confirmed that trend in Irish elections from then on. Fianna Fáil, another long-term consequence is that Fianna Fáil, perhaps unfortunately, kept their promises. And now this can often seem strange in today's world, because the allegation is generally that politicians don't keep their promises. But back then, Fianna Fáil did keep their promises. They did implement their manifesto once they got into government, and there was a virtual immediate spending splurge and a tax purge, with, of course, the abolition of rates on domestic homes, as I mentioned already. And there's a general view that the implementation of this manifesto after the election and the expansionary pro-cyclical approach of this government after 1977 probably contributed in no small part to the difficulties that we faced in the 1980s when following another economic recession consequent to another Middle Eastern war or another change of government and disruption in the Middle East, again, ironically, in this case in 1979 in Iran, which was to impact oil prices again and was to place both the Western democracy, the Western economic world, and Ireland, of course, as well, into significant difficulty once more. So there's a view by economic historians and historians in general that the implementation of the manifesto the Fianna Fáil manifesto after 1977 probably exacerbated the economic difficulties we were to experience in the 1980s. And then lastly, Lynch. Was he strengthened Was Haughey weakened or vice versa? Well, again, for those of you who are familiar with our history, I think it's clear that this long-term consequence of the 1977 election was that it was to weaken Lynch and it was to strengthen Charles Haughey. By the time we got to 1979, Lynch was finding that all those extra people in the parliamentary party were not necessarily his friends, and many were seeking to undermine his leadership. And ultimately, that is what occurred, with Charles Haughey eventually emerging from a contest with Lynch's preferred candidate, George Colley. But Charles Haughey was to emerge from a contest with George Colley as victorious and was to become the new boss of Fianna Fáil. And for those of you who are familiar with the personage of Charles Haughey, it's undoubtable that the new boss was not the same as the old boss. So, at the conclusion of our last lecture on the subject of the 1973 general election, I posited that, with the benefit of hindsight and from the perspective of the Fine Gael and Labour parties, that particular electoral contest was one which it would have been better for the National Coalition to have lost rather than to have won. Given the persistent security headaches they subsequently faced and the turbulent economic waters they were forced to traverse, waters then abundant with the accumulating kelp of unpopularity, a short-term disappointment in 1973 might have actually yielded greater electoral benefits for both of those parties after 1977. Indeed, in such an alternative timeline, there would have been at least the possibility of 2 consecutive terms of office for a stable Fine Gael Labour administration. In a somewhat similar vein then, an argument can be made that for Fianna Fáil, and particularly for the Lynchite wing of that organisation, the 1977 election was the one to lose rather than the one to win. As history has demonstrated, Fianna Fáil's thumping electoral victory, providing as it did the largest overall majority for a single party in the state's history, proved to be something of a poisoned chalice, the contents of which many thirsty hedonists would later regret imbibing. It proved to be a poisoned chalice for Jack Lynch himself and for his preferred successor, George Colley. From the dizzying heights of June 1977, Lynch led a veritable army of triumphant soldiers of destiny into the Dáil chamber, but in short order he was to discover that, much like mercenaries in wartime, the loyalty of backbench TDs is often a contingent one. And in this case, it was contingent on the leader's ability to provide the security of another election victory. By 1979, Lynch could no longer provide that sense of security, and the bulk of the new backbenchers, those whom Charles Haughey had described as his people, were now looking for a new Napoleon to guide them. The 1977 general election victory proved to be a poisoned chalice too for the wider Fianna Fáil organisation, facilitating as it did Charles J. Haughey's rise to the leadership of the party in 1979. Haughey's polarising personality and often nakedly opportunistic brand of political manoeuvring likely contributed to Fianna Fáil's failure to ever again achieve an overall majority. And lastly, Fianna Fáil's stunning victory in 1977 arguably proved to be a poisoned chalice for the electorate itself, including for those who so enthusiastically voted for the party in that election. The immediate sugar high of abolished taxes, increased public spending, and pro-cyclical state intervention in an already recovering economy was soon replaced by, to borrow Eamon Sweeney's phrase, the down, down, deeper and down experience of another oil crisis, another international recession, increasing inflation, higher unemployment, spiralling national debt, and eventually to the threat of intervention by the International Monetary Fund. And whilst some economists and historians may argue over the degree to which the implementation of Fianna Fáil's manifesto contributed to Ireland's economic woes during the 1980s, few would claim that it played no part in the deterioration of our fiscal position during that dark financial decade. Moreover, when we consider the extent to which the abolition of domestic rates contributed to the hollowing out of revenue sources for local government, revenues that were never adequately replaced despite promises from the Central Exchequer, Irish citizens have since endured a perennial absence of suitably and appropriately funded services at local government level. And given that any proposed return to a similar system of domestic rates is likely to remain politically unpalatable for some time to come, it is arguable that it may well have been better not to have abolished this particular revenue stream in the first instance. Thus, in that respect, at the very least, we all continue to live in the shadow of the 1977 general election. Thank you for your time and for listening.